It is a great honor and a privilege to introduce Dorothy Valier Glassman. We're here in your beautiful apartment in Jerusalem, and you have the most fascinating and unbelievable story.
Yeah.
Being born in France and growing up in France during the war.
Yeah.
So if you could tell us a little bit about your family.
Okay. I was born, quite interestingly, the 1st of January 1941 in a small village which was called Collonges-sur-Mont-d'Or, which was very near Lyon. My parents were Viennese, and they married in 1938, hush-hush, very quickly, because Jews were not allowed to gather together at that time. They married and they left.
They married in
Vienna, and they left. They were going to America, America. That was their aim and their goal. They left with very little, just a suitcase, and they were going to go through whatever to France to get a boat to America. Like in Casablanca, Laszlo is in Portugal. Why is in Portugal? Because he wanted to take a boat to America. They were young. They were rather leftist in their political outlook. And of course, France being the country of fraternité and liberté, my father aimed for France rather than Spain or Portugal. My father already had a PhD in chemistry in 1996, which was very difficult to get for a Jew, because of course in Vienna education was not free, and he had to pay for everything, and he didn't have any money. But he worked at the Neue Press, which was a newspaper in Vienna, and he wrote the scientific article for, it's a little bit like Time in London, or the New York, what did you call it in New York?
New York
Times in New York, and he wrote the scientific article. That's how he got money. His parents were very poor, but he always said that the people in the lab, the lower people, what I call in French le petit personnel, were very supportive of him, and very often he didn't have to pay for a lot of things that he needed to do his experiment. How did they arrive in France? My mother said to her dying day, I don't know how I managed to go. My mother had a sister who was living in France already in between the war. So their first aim was to go to Paris, to my aunt, to my mother's sister. How did they manage? They don't know. The only thing that my father remembers is that they were trying to cross the border from Switzerland to France the day after München. When they signed Daladier, Chamberlain,
a peace in our times.
Yeah, the peace in our time, exactly. They crossed the border the day after, and everybody was very happy, and they think that the supervision of the border was relaxed a little bit because people were probably a bit drunk or this and that. That's when they crossed. That was one of their miracle that they managed to cross at that day. There were 2 people without any guide or anything. They did everything by themselves.
Dorothy, can I just ask, were the grandparents, their parents, were they very supportive of them leaving Vienna?
My father's father had been taken, and he died in Auschwitz very early. I don't know. My grandmother my father's mother went to England as a maid. You could get a visa with her 2 daughters. With my father's 2 sisters. They went to Brighton as maid, but I don't know which year. There was such a thing that you could get a visa to England if you were willing to work as maid. So they all left at the same time in August 38. My grandmother and 2 daughters went to England. My father got married and left for America, and there was another son who was 12 who went with a group to Israel. And that's how they kind of, within a few weeks, they all left.
And you have pictures of your father's family and your mother's family?
Yes, but that's all from my mother's family, that's in Vienna. We think is the last picture of them all together.
And your mother, where's your mother in the picture?
My mother is here. She was the youngest. All the other brothers and sisters, some went to South Africa, some went to Australia, some went to Amsterdam. They kind of also, and my grandmother, the grandfather was already dead. That's on my mother's side. He's buried in a Jewish cemetery in Vienna. And my grandmother went with the Australian people who went to Australia.
And on your father's side?
And on my father's side, as I say, they all left in different places. Yeah. But that's a picture from 47. That's the first time we met together after the war. It was in London. And my father's father was already dead in Auschwitz in 41 or 2. We don't really, I have the exact date. There is a French wall in Roglit, which is on the old street between Jerusalem and Efrat, monument in the memory of all the people who died during the war, which, like all the name is there. I think he convoy 6 he was. So that's a very early convoy.
And Dorothy, you have also a picture of a grandfather who was very religious.
Yes, that's the one. Yeah, that's the one who's buried in Har Zitim.
Mount of Olives.
Mount of Olives. But he left way before the war to die. His ambition was to die in Jerusalem. Here you are.
So on the one side, they came from a very religious...
my father came from a very religious family, but he had caught up all the socialist ideas, and he was not so religious anymore. And my mother was much more of a conservative side. She already had dressmaker and shoemaker in a very rich family in... I wouldn't say completely assimilated, fairly assimilated. They had, the grandfather had built a kind of a wholesale in haberdashers things, and in soap, in all kind of things, and each child had a store, each Bezirk, each district, in each district of Vienna, each child had a store, and he provided for the store, and it was quite a rich family.
Can I ask, did your parents ever tell you that they had a lot of anti-Semitism and that's why they decided to leave, or what
yes.
made them decide to leave?
Well, my father come from what I think is Ukraine now. They came in during the First World War to Vienna. After the First World War, my father's family went back to their village or their little town where they owned a house. And there they suffered tremendous anti-Semitism. When they came back after 1918, my father talked about being beaten in the street because he didn't speak. Remember, it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire before the war. After the war, it was Ukraine, Poland. We don't know exactly. He didn't speak Polish. See, nobody spoke Polish. It was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So, in between the two wars, they really suffered from anti-Semitism. And in Vienna, I think they were young. Well, my father, at university, nobody spoke to him or lend him things.
Because he was Jewish?
Because he was Jewish, yeah. But it is suffering, but it's not really being harassed and being bullied. And he had the support of the small people, you know, the guy in the lab, the boy who helped him, and don't forget he had those socialist ideas, so he was a bit supported by that type of people. And my mother was what? She was 21, she had plenty of brothers and sisters, she was the youngest, and they all took care of her. But my mother did brush the pavement.
She was forced to?
She was forced to. She was part of those people who cleaned the pavement with brushes.
This is when the Anschluss happened?
Right.
When Germany occupied?
11 of November.
And she had to brush the pavement?
Yeah.
That must have left such a indelibly bad
Yes. But you know, they were both, their whole youth was damaged. So they married quickly. I still don't know if they married to leave. If they would have been peace, they would have married. I'm not quite sure. They lost so much of their life. You know, just to travel by yourself. My mother spoke some sort of French, because of course she was well educated and she was come from a good family where you learn English and French, besides German. You know, the girls had a certain polish. And they had a lot of scars from the lack of youth, from the lack of being free and having a youth, you know, early youth. So they cross. I don't remember when München was exactly, but they crossed to France. And, you know, they slept, it was summer, so they slept outside. They had very little money, and they also slept in hotel which didn't ask any question. They don't have a passport. Their passport was invalid because they had a passport from before the war. So there were a lot of hotel and little auberge which didn't ask question. And they finally arrived in Paris. How? They don't know. They didn't take day train, they took night train, because night train there's less check and things like that. When they arrived in Paris, they had no money. So in order to get money, my father, that was still 38, 39. What you did when you didn't have a visa or when you were illegal, what you did, you went to the employment office and you waited in front. You couldn't go and ask officially for a job because you were illegal, and you walk in front of the employment office until somebody says in Yiddish, "Are you looking for a job?" And of course they were very badly paid jobs, because they were Jews who were themselves trying to survive, like in Rue des Rosiers, Rue Pavée, all around there. They were kind of sweatshop where they lived in a small apartment. During the day they had the machine. In the evening they folded the machine, they pushed the machine and they put their bed. So he got some sort of job there which helped them to survive. And then my father got a job for the National Defense. And he was very lucky. Again, another miracle. He worked with Jean Perrin, who was a Prix Nobel 23, I think, I'm not quite sure, 23, and at different stage, and with Irene Joliot-Curie at different stage for different things, because my father had worked on heavy water. Heavy water is needed, not very clear, but it's needed for building the atomic bomb. And I don't know what he did. He never talked about it, but he was a chemist. And a chemist was very useful pre-war. And came the invasion, so Jean Perrin, Irene Joliot-Curie and my father had to transfer the whole lab in so-called zone libre. So my father crossed the zone libre officially with a car, with petrol, with everything. But my mother stayed in Paris, and she crossed the whole up to Lyon by herself. And to her dying day, she said, "I have no idea how I crossed." She said it was split seconds miracle. I could have died every minute of my trip. But she did it.
She couldn't go with her husband, with your father?
She couldn't go. No partner went, because there was only one car. And there was some material, some stuff, I don't know what. So they finally got a room, a maid's room, the in France, very posh house was on top, under the roof. There were rooms for the maids, for the cook, for the driver, for what. So they got one, in a small village called Collonges au Mont d'Or. The owner was the pastry shop at street level. And of course they needed a permit to stay. How do you call it in? You need a permit to stay in. Anyway, my mother managed to get. It's not a visa; it's a resident permit. Every 6 months, she had to go to the town hall and get her resident permit renewed. And of course, they didn't know if it was going to be renewed every 6 months. That's for 5-6 years. So that she had to do that, and she had to take care of all the paper. I was born in 41, so I was entitled to some food ticket. She had to go to the town hall to get the food ticket also, with a little French, with being illegal, because they had no legal paper. But we found out, because Lyon is very near this Vercors. There's in the center of France there is a mountain which is called the Massif Central, and in the Massif Central there is an area which is called the Vercors, which was where all the resistance was. And after the war we found out that the secretary of the town hall was a leader in the resistance. So that's how my mother got all her paper, because unknown to my mother, that woman kind of protected her.
It's a miracle.
I tell you, it was a miracle of every minute. Every minute. How come everybody knew my parents were upstairs? Because my mother had to go and buy bread and something to feed her husband and me, who was born.
And where were you born?
I was born in a hospital. Again, how my mother went to hospital, because Jean Perrin, the Nobel Prize, protected them and gave them made sure they got a car to go to the hospital. It was winter, it was a cold winter, and my mother always said she received a bunch of mimosa flower in January from Jean Perrin. That's what she remembers. From delivery, from the war, from everything. Jean Perrin was very nice. What he could do, he did. And then subsequently my father got different job with being a chemist. He was always very useful. And he had to go to Lyon, and it was very dangerous, and sometimes he couldn't go home because le pâtissier telephoned his office, his lab, don't come home, there's going to be a gathering of Jews. My parents had a sign at the window. If my mother put a dishcloth on the window, meant my father shouldn't come up because it was dangerous. There were some German around or something.
They were rounding up Jews.
They were rounding up Jews. So my parents had a sign, and the pâtissier at the end, after the war, told us he knew exactly the sign.
And they knew you were Jewish?
He knew we were illegal, he knew we were Jewish, he knew we couldn't speak. He didn't give. And all the people in the building, even the lady on the, when there was a roundup, the pâtissier used to tell my parents to go in his apartment. And when the German came to look at all the apartments, he said, well, there's nobody, that's my flat. And when he arrived upstairs, and he said, well, you see, there are people here. And the Patricians say, I don't know where they are. They've gone. I don't know where they are. See, so every moment was a miracle. There was a lady also in the building who kept me when I was small, when my mother had to go somewhere. Or when my mother, in 1943, there was another child born, another girl born. She kept me when my mother went to give birth to that hospital, another hospital. Monsieur et Madame Rigotier, that was their name. They were my babysitter when my mother had to go somewhere. They could have said, there is a family with a child, 2 children there. They never said anything. And even Madame Rigotier used to have a sister who lived in the countryside. You know, in the countryside they always had food. So she always brought food for me. Nobody gave us. Everybody knew. You could not know, because in a village everybody knows everybody. They never gave us.
And Dorothy, what is your earliest recollections?
Well, first of all, I spoke German. Don't forget, my first language as a baby is German. Even though my mother tried very hard, but her French wasn't good enough. So I was not to go out. If I went out, I wasn't allowed to speak. So I have only very little recollection. I remember going down the steps into the cellar when the bomb, when it was, when the siren, I remember the siren. And in Efrat, where my daughter lives, the siren has the same sound. And that is a very dangerous time for me. It's 10 o'clock on a Monday morning. When I used to babysit for my grandchildren, I used to lie on the sofa and try to control myself because I start to shake. That's something which is a residue of... the cellar was not like a miklat or a cellar when you keep wine. In the cellars, you kept coal, you know, and it's cheap coal, not coal which is one piece. It's a coal which is put together from powders and pieces like that. And I came out of that all black because there's nothing to sit down, there was no toilet, and there was really no space for people. So my mother was furious. I remember that because I was all black. What else do I remember? I had a very funny experience in London. I mean, in London it could have been, we happened to live in London at the time. There was a new vegetable which came onto a market, a root vegetable, something like a big turnip. And I asked the greengrocer what it is. He said, it's a root and you put it in the cholent. I said, okay. I bought it, I put it in the cholent. And, you know, I had a big table. I usually had a lot of young people, friend of my children at the table, and I spat it. As soon as it reached my mouth, I spat it. And I wasn't brought up like that. And I said, it has a taste of war. And it was rutabaga. It's called rutabaga in French. And in English it's called suede. And that's what I was brought up with. Boiled root with no salt, no nothing. So that's obviously a memory that I have, a taste memory. I have this noise memory. I remember also not being allowed to talk to people because I spoke German, and certainly was not a language to speak in 41, 42, 43 or 5 in Lyon. It's I don't have clear memory of things because I was really a very young baby.
Did you speak any French?
No. How could I speak French? My parents didn't speak French. I was not in contact with any French people. Yeah, Madame Rigotier. I probably picked up a few words from Madame Rigotier, but that's about it. And I'm very unhappy because I've tried to, these Rigotier people, it was a Monsieur, Madame, and two boys, to put them as the righteous of the nation in Yad Vashem, but I have no document. You know, I have no document that I went to school, I have no document that, or anything. And they don't want to take them. And it's because of them that I'm alive. They gave us food, they protected us. The pâtissier, I don't even remember his name. All that house protect, but they don't want to know anything in Yad Vashem.
It's a pity because without them, you wouldn't have been protected. You wouldn't have survived.
Absolutely, absolutely. Without this village, the entire, the people, the shops, you know, the baker and they all knew.
Do you remember when your sister was born?
No, not at all.
You were still
But I was, what, 2.5?
Still too-
2.5 is a bit young to remember anything. And you know, I was a very sick child. I was undernourished. I wasn't allowed to go out to do anything. So I was a very difficult child. A very difficult child. My mother had a lot of problems with me. But it's because of the circumstances. And my mother was undernourished also. They themselves, they didn't have anything.
Do you remember being hungry?
I don't remember being hungry, but my husband already knew to feed me. Whatever happened, I had to stop for a coffee, a pastry, a meal, because if I'm hungry, I become impossible. I can be, I'm a nice person, but if I'm hungry, things goes wrong.
See, that's maybe the memories from...
Probably. I also have kept things. For instance, when I walk into a room, I always know where the exit is. The first thing, unconsciously, I always spot the exit. There's a lot of things like that, little details. I still have quite a few dreams which are recurrent. I have a problem, it's that I didn't reach school before I was 7, and I didn't speak French, or very little French at the time, and my schooling was terrible, absolutely terrible. I didn't even manage to pass back road. There was no remedial teaching. I was probably slightly dyslexic and things like that. I just didn't want to sit. Took me a long time before I understood that I had to sit down and listen. I was indisciplined. I was everything you can imagine, but not nasty. But school and me, it just didn't work. I also had this obsession of becoming a nurse. If you wanted me to learn something, you say, you will need that for nursing. Then I would learn it. All the rest I wasn't interested. I also operated on all the dolls, my sister's dolls, not mine because I wasn't interested in dolls. I cut up all the dolls to see what was inside. I dismembered them. I mean, it was terrible. It was an obsession. And I think it's when I was probably 3, I'm not quite sure, I was sent away 3, 4 maybe, I don't remember exactly. I was sent away to a place to feed me and to take care of me. A kind of sanatorium, but sanatorium, I didn't have tuberculosis or anything, but I had all the children disease one after the other one. I had whooping cough. I mean, I was covered with scabies. I had lice because my mother couldn't get rid of them. There was very little water to wash me. I was in a very bad state. And in that place, there must have been a nurse or somebody who took specifically care of me and who made me feel good. So that's probably why I wanted to become a nurse. I have no idea. It's purely intellectual. I don't know why I had this obsession to become a nurse. And I became a nurse without any problem. I was a very good nurse. I got good mark at school. It was still, at the time, it was not hospital, it was not university-based, the diplomas. It was hospital-based. And every day I was a very good nurse. Took me a long time to recover physically from the war. At one time my father got a job in Normandy in probably 1947-48 maybe, and we lived, the factory had rented a castle or bought a castle and made apartment in that castle for the employees, and there was vast space, forest, old trees, you know, like the Renaissance castle with grass coming down and big alleys with old trees. And it was my savior because my parents bought me a bicycle and I could shout and run and climb the roofs, and not that I was allowed, but I could really expand and be free. And that's what saved me really. After that it went better.
Dorothy, did your mother's sister, did she ever come and visit you? Or?
Oh yes, it was very near Paris when we were in Normandy in 47, 48.
No, but during the war, during the war period?
Nobody came because everybody, it
was too dangerous.
It was too dangerous, you couldn't travel. Nobody came to visit us. The family, certainly not. And as far as I know, my parents didn't know anybody. We had no contact with people except in the village.
You know, were there any other Jewish people nearby?
Yes. There were also refugees in another room, but they didn't want to have anything to do with us because they say that they were from Alsace because they spoke French. They were older people and they spoke French, not very well. That's why a lot of German Jews or Viennese Jews say they were from Alsace-Lorraine because they have a strong German accent up there in France, in the northeast. At the time, you know, the border was not porous, but they had a very Germanic sounding accent. So he didn't want to have anything to do with us. So it was obvious that they were Jews, but and they had children, and I never played with them or anything.
Were there any other children that you did play with?
No.
So all this time
I was completely isolated.
You know what you did during the day? Did your mother...
Well, I gave a lot of problem to my mother, yes. We were in a room.
It must have been very, very difficult.
It was very difficult for my mother. There was no water. She had to go three floors down to the pump, where you pump water. And in winter the water was frozen. I mean, they had it very, very hard. They had it very hard, but some people had it harder. I mean, I'm sure you've heard horrendous story. I mean, that was extremely hard, but it was viable. I mean, we didn't have food, but we had those vegetables like all the French people. Except that we were hidden, and of course we lived, I found out after the war, 500 meters away from the headquarters of Klaus Barbie.
500 meters?
Down the road. I don't know if you know where the restaurant Bocuse, if you've heard Bocuse that was Klaus Barbie headquarters, and it was down the street.
Did your parents ever see him? Did they ever encounter him?
No, they didn't know about him. Because Klaus Barbie was known in Paris, but not in Lyon. I mean, remember, they were hidden. They didn't want to know anything. I went to prison with my mother.
So was this during the war?
During the war, when I was two and a half. We were imprisoned.
How come you went to prison?
We were probably taken in the street. And I only know we went to prison because I have the receipt of the little paper which was given to my mother to come out of prison, to be liberated. We stayed probably a month or something like that.
In this prison?
In Fort Palier, which is a very famous prison.
Is it very nearby Lyon?
It's in Lyon, yeah. I've never been back.
And did your father come and visit, or did
No! Don't forget, He
was in hiding himself.
He couldn't come. You can't. We could have gone to Auschwitz. But my mother was very pretty. She spoke excellent German. She probably, in the prison, they were, lower class soldiers, and either she charmed them out, or she told them, like it's a classic, it was a mistake. She was German and she had nothing to do in prison. We don't know. I only know because of that.
And your father, I'm sure he didn't know what was going on.
No, of course he didn't know. Madame Rigotier told them someday she went out for shopping and she didn't come back. So you put two and two together, it's very easy. She's in prison with a child. How long? He has no idea. Every day he has to wait.
Did your mother ever speak about it later on?
No, very little. My father wrote, which I put in my book, some things in his old age, and that's how I found out a lot of things. For instance, my father was very clever. When he left Germany, Austria was still a country, I'm not very clear, it was still a country which had communication, which was part of Germany. So when my parents got married, the grandparents and the people gave him a pair of sheets, a towel, you know, whatever they had left, because they're all ready to go to away. One give a blanket and a pot or something. My father made a kind of wooden structure and sent it to Hamburg Poste Restante. That means a kind of P.O. box. You know, you could send parcel which stayed in the post office. He sent it to Hamburg because the post office worked before between Austria and Germany. Once Germany had invaded France, of course they were post office between Germany and France. So he asked for that big parcel, it was an enormous thing, to come to France, and that's the only thing they had.
And they sent it.
And they, yeah, German, you know, Jäckes.
It's very efficient.
Very efficient, and that's the only thing they had. With some clothes, warm clothes, you know what you do when you don't know where you're going and people give you something? So that's what they had. And that's it. And you know, I needed diapers. So the neighbors gave. From the children, they had, you know, cloths or what have you. It was very, very difficult. And it was because you never knew what's going to happen the next second. If a German was there, my mother could fake. But if I opened my mouth in my broken German, it was finished. It was finished. It was
life and death could have been
constantly. It's like living under the guillotine all the time. And of course my parents were undernourished also. They didn't know what the future was. And then there came another child in 43. But that child was she reacted completely different. She was quiet. You put her in a corner, she stayed the corner. She never said anything. So thank God she was kind of protected because she was a good child.
What was her name?
Her name is Gabrielle. And again, talking of name, my name is Dorothée. But that's my official name. In France, in 1941, nobody heard of that name. Why am I called Dorothée? Because during the war, in France, you had the post office, the official post office, gave you a calendar. And on each day of that calendar, there was, with the date, the number, there was the name of a Christian saint. And during the war, you could only name children from that calendar. So my parents didn't want to give me a Christian name because they were not very believing anymore, but they didn't want to become Christian. So my father named me Sainte Dorothée because Dorothée means gift of God in Greek. It's an anagram of Theodore. So with a name like Dorothée, I can tell you something. During the war, I didn't suffer, but when I hit primary school in another little village, boy, did I suffer with that name. I don't have a Jewish name. I took one. I took one, Dorothy, and my second name is Irene because of Irene Joliot-Curie. This is, what else can I tell you? Is that enough?
Can I just ask, when the war ended, do you have any recollections when, in 45, when it finally came to end?
Yes, I have one very vivid memory when the American came. Would you like a coffee?
No.
Yeah. When the American came, they had trucks with the back of the truck which opened half, half went inside and the other. It made a kind of a platform, and they were giving away sweet and things like that. And it was a black person, a black soldier, who was giving away sweet and things like that. And my mother has all the war told me, don't speak to people you don't know, don't speak, don't speak, don't speak. And I didn't want to speak to him. And he was so handsome, and he had a wonderful smile, and he was full of life, he wasn't scared, he had a fabulous face. And then my mother said I could speak to him. That I remember. That was probably à la Libération, but it was still in Lyon.
And I'm sure he gave me some sweets.
He gave me some sweet, that I don't remember. But I remember that face. But he was so healthy. He was so smiling. And he was black. I'd never seen a black person. I wasn't scared. But he was so positive. He was so different from all the people who were around me. It was like sunshine.
And you remember coming out of the house now, did you feel free, or can you remember?
People think that once they signed the treaty, everything was fine. It took a long time. We didn't have food.
It was still rationing.
It was still rationing. Rationing. There was nothing to ration anymore. There was no food. There was no. It lasted a long time until my father got a job in the Pyrenees. And there I was already probably 6.5, something like that, 6.5, 7, before he found this job. And we moved. And it was again a very small village. But then there was a DP camp very near. So to me, I didn't make the difference between what was happening in Lyon and the DP camp. To me it was one thing. And those men, they were all kind of men in that camp. They were all kind of skin color. They were Vietnamese. I think they were Vietnamese, Oriental looking people. I don't know if they were Japanese or what. And every day they used to go in the morning, come back in the evening, and I couldn't understand. They were all together, those men. I couldn't understand. I remember that very clearly. But it took me a long time before I started to remember things which were happening. I was very confused.
And when did you first go to school?
Well, it was in the Pyrenees, so I must have been about 7.5. I had to walk 2 kilometers 4 times a day to go to school.
And you learned French? Slowly.
And I learned, it was terrible. It was so traumatic. They sat me at a desk with a pot of ink and a pen, with a nib. And they made me do, on a line, between 2 lines, a stick and a round, a circle. I understood later that it was the beginning of writing an A. But nobody explained to me what I was doing. And I didn't want to cooperate because it was so stupid. I was already 7, and I had grown very quickly. And there was, subsequently in 46, there was another baby, which I took care of because my mother was really finished. And they sat me and they made me make circle and stick. They didn't explain to me. I didn't want to sit down. I poured the ink on the paper, but it was not nasty. I was lost. And it was in a village. And in a village, it's not like in town when you have one room for first grade, one room for second grade. Each row was a different grade. And at the end was the kindergarten, where they played. They played with toys, and the teacher had a small chair, and the teacher sat on the chair, and you could comb her hair. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to play. I had never played. I wanted to do what I wanted. I remember very clearly, it was awful. It took me a long time before I understood what they wanted from me. But I was intelligent. They needed to explain to me. In Lyon we had nothing. I didn't have any toys, I didn't have any pen, I didn't have any paper. It's not like, and my mother said, you're going to school. I didn't know what school was. My children, when my daughter went to school, she had seen her brother going to school. Yeah. When my son went to school, she had seen people going to school with their rucksack, with their sack, and I didn't know what was school.
And how were the other children with you, the other French children?
I don't remember any other children. I felt so isolated. I was so used to be on my own. I can see the little children in kindergarten playing, but I can't see anybody on the grade side. I can't. It's not there. It's not there in my memory. The only thing I was interested in was the kindergarten. I don't even remember a desk of the teacher or something, but I remember being when I did something wrong, they made me put my finger like this, and with a ruler they bang.
And you remember that?
Oh, it's very painful. So just to show you how I was already aware how to solve problems, because I was alone. I was nobody. I had to occupy myself all the war, so I had to really take care of myself. In fact, this is it. I knew how to take care of myself as much as I could. I asked my mother not to cut my fingernail too short. So if you leave your fingernail a little bit, the ruler cannot come to your too much. It stops a little bit, the ruler, and it's not so painful, but I can tell you it's painful. That I remember, but that's after the war.
And slowly you started to speak French? And
slowly, yeah. It's when we moved to Normandy that my father got a better job. So we moved with better jobs. So we went to Normandy, again in a small village.
How old are you now when you went to Normandy?
When we moved to Normandy, I must have been about 9, 10. But I had another problem. The little French I spoke was very, very South accent. When I arrived in Normandy, they have their own accent, which is not a Southern accent. They made fun of me. And I was still isolated. I still didn't have friends. It was very difficult to open. But the teacher was nice. She understood that I was not French. And she was good to me. She always gave me half of the work to do the homework and things like that. So, and again, there was a lot of space. That's when we lived in that castle where I could expand myself and really feel free. So that was good. Then we went later on in the, when I was 10, 11, 12, we went to the city in Marseille. Or we didn't live in the city, we lived in the suburb. And again, there was a lot of space and everything, but then I went to high school, so that was different.
And you made French friends?
I made a couple of friends, you know, but it's in those small places, you know, in France. I'm sure in England it's the same thing. The people know each other from the kindergarten, and they go and they go and they go. You know, the family know each other. It's not like today people move around. At that time people didn't move around. People stayed. Their grandparents were born in that village. Their parents and probably their great-grandparents, they were all peasants. See, so and of course I didn't like dog because of the German Shepherd. During the war, you know, I was that high, just the height of the German Shepherd. I have a memory of inside their mouth, how do you call the inside of a mouth of a dog in English? Anyway, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, you know, with their teeth and everything. The canine and everything. So dogs were not my friends, so I was scared. Everywhere on the way to school, for half an hour there were dogs everywhere. Then there were the cows, which I was not too friendly. Then at one time after the war I had an accident with a horse, so I was scared of horse, so I'm really not a country girl.
And Dorothy, did you ever feel yourself as French?
I do. I feel very French.
When did it start that you really felt that you had been accepted into French society, or that you were French?
I don't think I was accepted.
Or assimilated into the French culture?
I think in nursing school. Because in nursing school we were half in the hospital, half in school, where people came from all over. So in nursing school, it was not the children from the village. It was people who came from all different aspects of life.
And where did you study? Was it
in Marseille?
And your family stayed in Marseille?
Yes, we stayed for a long time in Marseille. They stayed. My parents are buried in Marseille. We stayed from when I was 12, so 51, 52, something like that. Until they died. My sisters still live in Marseille.
Can I ask, when the war ended, or do you have any memories of your parents trying to find out what happened to their family members or extended family?
Well, I don't remember, but I remember going to London to see my father's mother and my father's family. In 47, 48, 47, they had a family reunion.
That must have been very special going.
Well, not so, because I didn't know them. They spoke another language. Finally I spoke French, and they didn't speak French. They spoke English. And they all spoke German anyway.
And did you know a bit of Yiddish, or could you?
No. I learned Yiddish, the little bit of Yiddish I know I learned with my husband when he was in the diamond business.
But German, you could speak to your grandmother in
No,
German?
because I had forgotten.
And I think you have a picture in the book of that reunion.
Yes, that's right. We went to see my father's mother, who was in England, in London, with her two daughters.
Did you develop a connection, or was it difficult?
Later on, when I was 14, 15, my parents sent me to England so I would learn English. And I went to see my grandmother, who was still with one of her daughters. She was an old lady by then. And you know what? It was very traumatic, because we didn't have a common language. We didn't know each other. We didn't have a common language. She was a very dry German type lady, and there was nothing came through. You know, she didn't open her arm. I was her first grandchild. You know, you smile at the child. You take her. There was no warmth at all. It was so traumatic. I still remember.
And her daughters, did you develop a connection with the daughter?
But later on, when I finished my nursing and I had worked a little bit in France, I got bored because it's always the same thing. I went to England and I took my English diplomas and I worked in England, and then I developed a relationship with my aunt because I spoke English. And they took care of me. They invited me for Shabbat and things like that. So I developed a friendship with my aunt and my uncle. But the grandmother was dead already. I only saw her when I was 14.
And in Marseille, did your parents? Did they have any Jewish customs, or did you celebrate the Chagim?
No,
Pesach?
nothing.
No Pesach?
We knew we were Jewish. We didn't try to become Christian or anything, but we didn't do anything. Absolutely
nothing. Did you go to the shul? Or
nothing.
No connection with
no connection with religion at all. Don't forget, France is a laïc country, and we had a Thursday of school, so you could practice whatever religion you wanted and learn whichever religion you wanted. And there was nothing Jewish around us until we went to Marseille. But I had not notion, but I had strong notion of Jewishness. I don't want to say Judaism. You remember my mother had a sister in Paris. They had eloped before the war because he was a communist and she was not. My aunt wanted to marry him, and the parents didn't want her to marry him, so they eloped to France.
Was he Jewish?
Oh yes, he was very Jewish. He was a rabbi, but he was communist, but a real communist. He worked for the Naya Press, which was a communist newspaper in Paris. And this building, in the building of the newspaper, there was a lot of association and things like that, all communist, and they had des maisons d'enfants. I would call them orphanage for Jewish children who didn't have any more parents. French Jewish children who didn't have any parents. And it was very much sponsored by Shomer HaTzair. And more communists, if you know, more communists. And they had summer camp. And I was not an orphan, but because my uncle was connected to that organization, my parents sent us to those summer camp. And those summer camp, I discovered everything. I discovered the Holocaust. Because I hadn't understood what I went through.
And your parents didn't discuss it with you?
No, my parents didn't talk. They talk of before the war and after the war, but I didn't know what it meant. You know, they talk, my mother would say, before the war I used to go to the Winterwald and we walked and we had wine and we were part of groups and things like that. But, you know, the war didn't mean anything to me. all what I've told you, it's things which I worked to find out. When I was young, I had no memory. I was living yum,
Day by day.
day by day. And when I went to those summer camp, I was the youngest. I was 7 when I went to my first camp. They were very, very simple. You know, we had soldiers' bed, the communist town hall lent them folding bed. We had army blanket. Had plenty of food, plenty of games, and the shower we were showered, but very simple. And then there were all those people. They were young. They were older people. They were boys of 18. They were girls of 12. It was an all different mixture, different group.
Was it a Jewish?
It was all Jewish, and all children who went through the war. And they talk.
These were survivors.
They were survivors. They were all survivors, one way or the other. I was the only one who had parents. And they talk, and I listen, and I learn, and I started to understand what was going on.
But did you ever see any of the children with numbers on their heads?
No, I don't remember.
Maybe they were in different camps or in hiding.
Maybe they were in different camps.
But these were all survivors.
They were all survivors. There were about 250 survivors. Or 100, I don't know.
What year was this? This was...
Oh, I went to those camps until I was 16, 17.
But the first camp you went to, this is very soon after the war.
Yes.
So it's still very fresh. It's still very...
Well, to them, yes. To me, I didn't understand. It took me a few years to understand. So I heard things which I'd never heard. And that's when I started to understand. And then there were the madrichim, who themselves were Holocaust survivors, who started to talk about going to Israel. I have no notion of what Israel was. Do I go to Israel? Don't I go to Israel? Do I stay here? Do I learn Hebrew? That was all my education.
And your parents never discussed that they had a grandfather that's buried here or buried in Israel or Zionistic?
My father was a Zionist before the war. He had been in Baal, I think. There was a congress.
In Basel, they had it
in Basel, yeah. They were aware. But they never talked to us like we talk to children now. They ask us about schooling, about, but they never talk to us.
And just unbelievable that you were with these Holocaust survivors very soon after the war. Did they discuss about the experiences?
No, they didn't discuss it with me. I was 7. You don't take care of a little, and I was very
you must have
thin.
overheard.
Yeah, I heard them speaking, and I listened. They didn't talk to me. They talked among, we were group 7 group, 8 group, 10 group, and so on and so forth.
And these were all orphans.
They were all orphan, and they were all talking, and I was hearing those things, and absorbed. And for instance, when we lived in that castle in Normandy, there were apartments for family, and then there were rooms for visitors or single workers and things like that. And sometime in the evening, there were people who were coming into my parents' house, and there was one specific lady, Mrs. Sommer, her name was, Madame Sumer, but of course it was Summer. And she kept crying and crying. Every time she came, she cried. Asked my mother, what's the matter with her? And my mother said, oh, she's a poor woman. She didn't explain to me. I'm sure she had lost a lot of people during the war, and she came to talk to my mother because my mother listened, and she knew my mother was Jewish, and things like that. See, when we were in the Pyrenees, we had a woman who came. She was thin. She's terrible. She looked terrible, and my mother said to me, her name is Rosette, and she came to help me to take care of you. But in fact, Rosette was arriving from the camp. But my mother didn't explain to me. I don't know if I would have understood. How do you explain to a child what happened during the war? She was happy that I didn't mention anything and that I was the way I was. So, of course, Rosette was there. You could see she was looking, she was scared. She always looked everywhere, and she was afraid for me. She didn't let me do anything, you know. It's only much later, when I was an adult, that I put things together. But our parents never explained anything to us. It's only when I started to read and I started to think and to stop and think at what happened. And with my knowledge, I put it together.
And can I ask, it must be very strange. When did you first have your first Seder or go on Yom Kippur?
I remember very clearly. My husband come from a religious family, and one of the conditions to marry him is that we lead a religious life. And we married. First of all, I went under the chuppah. I had never seen a chuppah. I didn't know what a chuppah was. I didn't know what you do under the chuppah. I didn't know. I could organize a Christian wedding because some of my friends got married and I helped them to organize their wedding.
You'd never been to a Jewish wedding?
I had never seen a picture. I had never seen a film. I had never talked. I had no idea. I went under the chuppah. I could very well annul, is that an English word?
Yes, to annul.
Dissolve my wedding, because I had no idea. I had no idea. I didn't understand a word when they read the ketubah.
Did you know any Hebrew?
I didn't know any Hebrew. Maybe I knew Mazel Tov. That's about it. I didn't know any Hebrew. I didn't know anything when I went under the chuppah. And I organized the wedding. I went to the mikveh. I didn't know what a mikveh was or anything.
And in which town or
I went to the mikveh in Herzliya.
You were married in Israel?
I'm married in Israel because my husband was French. You know, have you gotten a few more hours? If you want me to tell you my story, you have no idea.
This is incredible.
Shall I make you a coffee?
No, this is good.
Well, let's have let's have a couple of cookies.
Wow. Yeah. Sure. So Dorothy, I am so grateful to you. There are no words.
My pleasure.
There are no words, really.
My pleasure.
Your story is just absolutely unbelievable.
Okay, you make
the
me
miracles. No, it really is. Dorothy, to be born in France during the war, to have survived in France during the war, that the neighbors didn't inform, where so many did inform. It's remarkable. They should all be given Chasidei Motalam.
Absolutely.
The whole village, the whole town, because
and
what they
I
did
can't
was
do
amazing.
it for one person. Yad Vashem doesn't want to do it.
Well, you know what? Please God, everybody who watches this or who knows this will recognize that they were such righteous people, because Alavai would have been done in other places.
Yeah.
And you really are a miracle. And I'm so grateful to you. I really am.
My pleasure.
So I'd like to ask you, Dorothy, what message do you impart to your children and grandchildren?
Well, my motto is to cope with what comes my way. And that has helped me, when I decided to marry my husband, well, with absolutely no Jewish education, except the fact that I knew I was Jewish and I mustn't tell it. I mustn't say it. I must admit that I never said publicly and loudly that I was Jewish before I was 18. Nobody knew I was Jewish when I was in primary school, in secondary school. Maybe one or two persons knew it when I was in nursing school, because I had a very good friend in nursing school who just died recently. She knew I was Jewish. Another girl knew I was Jewish, but because they were also not belonging. They were from somewhere else.
A bit different.
So I've never said I was Jewish before I was 18, and I said it in a group of Jewish people. It was an incredible story that I used to go to something called the Festival d'Avignon, which was a theater festival by the National Theatre in Paris. And they had a festival where they gave good theater with cheap seat, and people came from all over Europe, and we happened to be there earlier, a group of people coming from all parts of Europe, and we happened to be together, and we started to sing, songs from the radio. And then the guy on the guitar started with Ava Nagila, and everybody sang. And he carried on, and everybody sang. And then he said, well, how come you know those songs? So each of us said, because I'm Jewish, and came to me, and I said, because I'm Jewish. It was the first time I said it among people I didn't know. So when I had to marry, I decided to marry my husband. So one of the things was that we had to lead a Jewish life. Hence, we had to organize a wedding. First of all, we had to decide which part of the world. My husband was French, but after the war he left for Canada, because my mother-in-law lost her husband and she didn't want to live in France anymore. So he was Canadian and he was working in Japan, but residing in London at the time, where I met him when I went to London to work. That's where I met my husband. So we decided to marry in Israel because it was a common ground. In France, my mother-in-law lived in New York, she had to come. In England, everybody had to move. If they were going to move, they might as well move to Israel, where all the Israeli cousins were. So I went to Israel with a moledet, and I organized a Jewish wedding, having no idea. My sister-in-law had found a Tadmor in Herzliya, where they spoke English. So our wedding was not a traditional wedding. I mean, we had a chuppah and everything, but in fact, it was in '66. It was just before '67.
Before the war?
Before, there was nothing in Israel. There was very little meat. Meat was expensive. Organize a buffet and all that. It was not easy. And it was in fact a fantastic party, because all the people who came to my wedding hadn't seen each other since before the war. All the Israelis couldn't come to Europe. They couldn't afford it. So a lot of people from Vienna came, a lot of people from my mother-in-law also made Aliyah, and they didn't know they made the Aliyah. And two people were invited to my wedding by both sides of the family. They received two invitations. We didn't know we knew the same people from before the war. Or Harshara, don't forget, in Marseille there was a whole school of Harshara. So it was it was like a big barbecue.
A reunion,
a reunion of people.
And your parents were at the wedding?
Of course my parents came to the wedding. And they met people they hadn't seen since before Vienna. And my mother-in-law met people she had known in Germany, in Bnei Akiva. You see, those people were all dispersed. Some of them had made Aliyah, but they didn't tell my mother-in-law who was in New York that they made Aliyah. They just discovered each other.
It was a very significant wedding in many ways.
Very significant, but it was not, we didn't dance, because I didn't know you dance at a wedding. There was music, but it was like a big barbecue. Of course, the Israelis were very happy to have meat.
So I want to ask you, Dorothy, you are so positive and your whole outlook is so incredibly, what can I say, it really is very positive. What you've gone through and what you've been through, how come you have this wonderful outlook on life?
Don't know. When my husband, when we talked about getting married, so one of the things was to get religious. I had no idea. So, kashrut, it goes like that. I always coped. I'm a coper. So, it's very easy. You have meat and milk and they must never meet. So in the operating theater, you have sterile and unsterile, and they must never meet. So I reduce things to what I know. And I never made a mistake. Maybe I made once, once I cut myself because I didn't know Beshishim. So, so in the kitchen, I did things, but I use oil instead of butter and things like that. I'm very practical. So it was, once I understood the problem, I could sort it out. I used to smoke at the time. Smoking was difficult because I didn't smoke on Shabbat. So I didn't smoke on Shabbat, but the minute we make Havdalah, I lit a cigarette. That was a little bit more difficult. Okay, going to mikveh, but I had been once, going to mikveh, it's not a big deal. Huh? It's understandable, you have to be very clean and submerge yourself, no big deal.
And living in Israel, was that always something you wanted to do?
No. Why would I live in Israel? My husband had his... So, you want to hear the story, I'll tell you the story. So, that kashrut, then I had to go and live in Japan. Japan? I knew where it was on the map, but that's about it. You're young and your husband tell you we have to go and live in Japan. But before that we have to go and live in Canada. But first of all, okay, we got married. I was in Israel. He had been in Israel before and he had family in Israel and he spoke Hebrew. So he kind of coached me a little bit. Then we came back to London. We lived in London for 18 months. Then he has to go to Canada because at the time, if you become Canadian, you have to live 1 year out of 10 years in Canada to keep your passport. Okay, go to Canada, live in Canada. But Canada was America for me. I come from a European country. That was in the 60s. From a European country and I go and live in Canada, everything is different. First of all, it's the street are double the size of everything. The building are double the size. There's no market. There's no market. Where do you buy your food? In a supermarket under sellotape. I was used choosing each tomato and each potato, and the butcher cut what I want the way I wanted. Here I had to buy everything under sellotape. I mean, it was terrible. You choose a chicken. You have to see the chicken. Anyway, I go to work, and they have everything disposable. They throw away every syringe, they throw away every needle, everything, every sheet, everything they throw away. I worked in London where they still boiled the instrument, not even autoclave. They boiled, we had a boiling room where we had things, big container boiling all the time, where we throw the instrument, we take them out, we have to cool them down. We still thread the needle with a thread to sew the patient. They had
sutures.
The sutures. They had ready-made sutures, disposable. You throw everything. That was such a cultural shock, you have no idea.
And did you already have children by this time?
No, I had another story. When, I was pregnant. By then it was Expo 67. And my husband, bless him, had masses of children, of friends all over the world, which he had made because he was a very friendly chap. And they all come to Expo 67 and they stay with me, and I had to cook and change the sheets, and I was a hotel and I was pregnant. My son was born in February in Canada, in Montreal. There were 2 meters of snow. We couldn't get the car out, so I had to walk to the hospital in the snow. That was another experience, because in Marseille it didn't snow. And then we went to Japan, and you keep a kosher home in Japan in the 60s. There was no Chabad, there was a Jewish community, but it was not kosher. I imported my meat, 1,000 kilo per time. I had a storage box in Yokohama Harbor, in the big frozen hangar. And I used to go to Yokohama with my car, my muffler, my coat, and I got my 3 months of meat in my car, which I kept at home. Go and cook kosher with nothing available from a kosher home, a kosher store.
And your husband, was he dealing with metals in Japan as well?
Yes, that's what his job was. Japan is a manufacturing country, has no raw material. So all the raw material is imported, and he imported non-ferrous metal. But not the metal, the mineral from the mine. And that was his job. He was a trader.
And did you learn Japanese?
I learned Japanese because I had no brera.
No choice. Wow.
I had no choice. Because in the mid-60s, nobody spoke English. Well, the intellectual, but the shopkeeper didn't speak English, and I had to cope what came my way.
And schooling for the children, what is...
Including for the children. There was an American kindergarten, a Montessori school, which was very good. So they went to that school. And then primary school, they went to a bilingual school where they learned Japanese to read and write.
And do they still remember the Japanese today?
No. Because I had to go then after that, after when my son became, I think he was 6 or 7, I don't remember exactly, spoke good Japanese for his age. I wanted a Jewish school. You know, he only had the Judaism he got at home, and it was not enough. You have to learn to live with Judaism, not just at home, and then at school you can't eat this, you can't eat that, it was no good. We needed a Jewish proper school. So my husband, who was representing Raffaelli in Japan, we went to Japan we sold our business to Raffaelli, and we went to South Africa to teach the office how to do business in Japan. And there in Johannesburg there was good school for the children.
It was Yeshiva College.
That's right. They went to the primary Menorah school, it was called Menorah School. Until one day we were in France on holiday, and my son said to me, "Mama, there's so many foreigners here." He wasn't used to live among people who spoke French, who looked French, he was used to live in Japan among Japanese people, in South Africa, among people who spoke English, and certainly didn't look like the French, and all the black people and everything. And he didn't. So I said to my husband, we have to go back to Europe. And also, it was mid-70 by then, the apartheid started to not really be very stable.
It was 76 was the Soweto riots.
Right.
In 76.
We were there for the Biko affair. So we arrived before when were the big riot? Sharpeville was.
Sharpeville was in the 60s, in the late 60s, but Soweto riots was in 76.
So we were there for the riot.
It's a very bad time. Yeah.
We arrived, I think, just after or at the end of it, and I really didn't agree with the apartheid. It was wrong. So we went back to Europe.
How long did you stay in South Africa?
3.5 years, 3.5 years. They were good years. The kids learned a lot. We traveled. We went to Namibia, we went to Zimbabwe, we traveled a lot.
And did you make friends, South African friends?
Not really, no. We made friends with the Wachenheim.
Wachenheim, there was with the butcher.
They were German. And she used to make some very German dishes. We went to eat. Otherwise, I
was in the same class as, well, I knew their son and their daughter.
Yeah, no, I knew the old. But yeah, maybe that was the son. No, because they are older.
Yeah, they had the Wachenheimers. It was in Romfontein and in. Sure, that's.
And I made friend with Rebetson Lapin. Did you know her? And very friendly. I remain friendly with her until today. Otherwise, I knew a lot of people, but I did a lot of things personally. In Japan, I did, I created things. In South Africa also, but with Jews and foreign and non-Jews. I was very involved always in the community in Japan, and needed thing. With another 3 girls, we created a school of Lamaze method for delivery in Japan. And in South Africa, I was part of a group who created a group for death and dying, taking care of people who die and the family 3 months after the death. And then we went to England, back to London. We both had lived in London separately, together, and we liked London, and it was a good...
And when did you come to Israel?
11 years ago, that's
11
all.
years. And you happy you came to Israel?
Well, I came to Israel because my grandchildren and now my great-grandchildren are here. That was my only reason. I love London, and I still love it. No, I don't think I was terribly Zionist, but I cope with what I have to cope with.
Well, that's wonderful.
That's, I think, is my motto.
So Dorothy, I'm so grateful to you, and
My
this has
pleasure.
been an absolute, it's been incredible. It really
Yeah.
has been very,
Yeah.
very special, and you should just have mazel and bracha from your family, and at Mavisrim till 120 in very good health, and just
Thank you.
enjoy your family and your inspiration.
Just to go back, because we were talking of the Holocaust. I worked for 10 years for the Jewish Marriage Council in London, and the Holocaust. Then my experience helped me with the people who came to me. Yeah.
It's amazing.
So I've been able to use my experience for other people. There we are. Thank you very